Hey, welcome everyone. It's nice to see so many familiar faces and new faces as well. My name is Sally Thurston from the Maynard Library. Just before we get started, we are recording this event. So if you know someone that missed it, feel free to share the link. We'll be posting that on the library YouTube channel and on the virtual events tab of the library website. And we'll share it to various committee sites as well. Just a point of order, we'll be having a question and answer session after David's talk. You're welcome to type your question in the chat box or just unmute yourself to ask your question. We do ask that you keep yourself muted during the talk just for good quality of recording. Okay, we are delighted to have David Mark back at the library speaking for us. This time as a member of the Sesquicentennial Steering Committee. I think it's a lesson to everyone in Maynard how to say and spell Sesquicentennial in the next few months. I'll post some links in the chat for more information about the committee and how to participate and stay informed. There is a Facebook page if you want to follow that. But let's get on with the talk. David Mark has been a resident of Maynard for 20 years, and since 2009, he's been a contributor to our weekly newspaper, Beacon Villager, writing his column, Life Outdoors. The column covers a broad range of topics, including local history, outdoor recreation, and natural history. Collections of these columns form his two books, Maynard, History and Life Maynard, History and Life Outdoors, and Hidden History of Maynard. David is with us tonight to speak about the new history published by the steering committee called Maynard, Massachusetts, A Brief History. The book will be on sale this Saturday in the library parking lot from 10:30 to 12.
10 to 12.
10 to 12, okay. Welcome, David, and watch for some links in the chat.
All right, Sally, thank you very much. And I'm so glad to have an audience tonight. What I'll be talking about and showing slides from are not our first history book, which is the one from 1921. It's closely titled A Brief History of Maynard, Massachusetts, nor the second official history book, which is, as you can see on the spine, History of Maynard, 1971, the blue book. But instead, what we're going to be talking about today is this book, The Production of the Sesquicentennial Steering Committee. You'll notice the picture on the top is the parade from 1921. The picture on the bottom is our clock tower against a nice blue sky with pretty clouds. On the back, there's a small picture representing the sale of houses by the mill in the Depression. And below that, a picture of when the carnival used to come to town and set up in Crow Park. And for those of people who think, okay, really a carnival? There used to be years when a circus would come and set up with live animal shows, including elephants, and a big top tent here in Maynard. No longer. All right, so before I go away, it's just pleasant to see all of you. And again, we'll be taking questions at the end of this. And now I'm going to switch over to this. All right, there we are. Slideshow. First slide. So I know I didn't get a chance to ask you, but for the few people I see, could you wave if you're hearing me clearly? All right, and wave again if you see the slide. Okay, then we're good. So here it is, the book launch event, a long time production. So a reminder, the book will be for sale, the library parking lot this Saturday, 10 to 12. It's cash, check, or Venmo, price is $22. All profits go towards the celebration of Maynard's 150th, i.e. Sesquicentennial anniversary. So 100 years ago, 50 years ago now, we've had a history book. This has been in a long time making. So September 2017, the Sesquicentennial, say that 3 times fast, steering committee created And then in November 2017, the book proposal. Almost a year later, the Board of Selectmen approved that and committed to buying 600 copies, which we're now trying to sell to members of Maynard and the larger universe. This past April, just we were swinging into the COVID epidemic, the text and images were submitted, and on October 26th, the books arrived here in Maynard. The initial proposal was a sort of simplistic 4 chapters, each about 50 years. So we are trying to some degree covering all of the history of Maynard. And then it became larger than that. So there's a whole section on before Maynard was Maynard, meeting the Maynard family, discussion of how crucial the river and the railroad were to town, what the downtown has gone through, Maynard boom and busts, Digital Equipment Corporation, which was so important for Maynard for 41 years, and a chapter we're calling 2021 to the Future, bringing you some 50,000 words and 90 images. Let's begin with a rock. We have to understand that a lot of what we sit on is the results of glacial ice ages marching through here back and forth. The last ones coming through, moving across this area about 50,000 years ago. And glaciers don't actually retreat, they melt in place. So the last of the melting was taking place about 10,000 years ago, leaving behind this tremendous amount of detritus. And as anyone who's never known who stuck a shovel in the ground, you tend to hit rock. You get down a few inches of topsoil, you start hitting clay, you start hitting rock, and you start seeing these are called glacial erratics, meaning large boulders which may have been moved hundreds of miles, scraped along, rounded along the bottom of the glacier, and then dropped off here. So this is just one of the many ones you see along the rail trails and the woodland trails. The area we live in was inhabited by the Nipmuc Native Americans, which were one of the many groups that were speaking what was referred to in the Eastern Algonquian language. You had the coastal Massachusetts, the Wampanoag, the Narragansett, the Pequod, and then down on Long Island, the Shinnecock. And the point was that the Nipmuc did not have access or didn't have free access to the ocean. So they were a lower population density because they didn't have the bounty of, ocean fishing, low tide, clams, fish that you could net. So, but they still did very well fishing in the rivers, hunting, collecting, gathering. So this was the group these are the groups that were here when the Europeans arrived, starting in the 1600s. And these are representatives of the Nipmuc Native Americans. This picture was taken in 1924. The Nipmuc still occupy 2 reservation areas, one near Worcester and the other in northern Connecticut, much diminished from what their original lands were, of course. Now, sort of the book goes into how land was basically sold by the Native Americans or forced sales or just actual taking. So there's all this sort of cascades of the loss of land over time, decimation by multiple diseases, a culmination. Okay, here on the left, we have King Philip, Metawan, who the Wampanoag Indian led the war in 1675-76, attacked many settlements, attacked and razed Sudbury, attacked Marlborough, and the Native American organizations came close to driving the colonists entirely out of what we call now New England. They had actually approached their traditional enemies, the Iroquois, a bit further into the New York area and asked them if they would join in. And if they had, probably Europeans would have been driven out entirely, but they did not. The Wampanoags were mostly operating in the Nipmuc region, which led to even non-combatant Nipmuc Indians being rounded up and moved off to Deer Island in the Boston Harbor because they felt they were collaborating with the warrior Indians. The 2 juxtapositions here is you have 2 very important people to what became Maynard, King Philip, and on the right, Ken Olsen, who founded Digital Equipment Corporation, and his wedding photo from 1950. So 250 years apart, these are two people who had a tremendous impact on what became Maynard. With the defeat of the Native Americans, the land was pretty much there for the taking. Individual farmers started coming in. There were land grants. So Sudbury to the south had originally started and then extended itself all the way up to the Assabet River. And then in 1683, Stowe was created on the other side of the Assabet River. If you remember the first side, this was all sort of mean land. It was surveyed and not thought it would be really support a lot of people because it was so rocky and hilly. This was in contrast to the Sudbury and Concord River valleys, which were relatively flat and had floodplains and were easy to farm, had been farmed by the Native Americans and were easy to refarm by the colonists. And one of the points I want to make about population density is you have to realize that Native Americans did not have the domesticated animals that the colonists brought with them. So they didn't have cattle or pigs or sheep or horses. So the colonists needed a much higher yield per acre of things they were going to grow, which meant wheat and corn, to feed their animals. On the other hand, because they were also eating these animals, they can have much higher population density themselves. So there was an entirely different need of use for the land on the two populations.
Steve, you wanted me to call?
Which led on the continual displacement of the Native Americans further and further west. This happens to be the foundation of a house that was built in 1705. It's known as the Marble Whitney Parmenter homestead because it was originally the Marble family for 6 generations. Then a daughter married a Whitney, and then their daughter married a Parmenter, but the same family occupied it from 1705 to 1924, at which time it burned to the ground. And what we have left is this foundation with these very nice steps to the basement you see in the background. Now, there were roads through this area. So this is a celebration in June 1976, 1 year after the bicentennial for this, celebrating the April 19th, 1775 march of the Minutemen from Stowe to Concord to shoot at the British. And they marched down Concord Road about 8 miles, leaving Stowe at 5 a.m. in the morning in order to get to Concord in time to join the battle against the British. And this marker, which is right on Concord Street, the intersection of Concord and Route 27, is still there and celebrates the line of march, which the Minutemen reenact every April 19th. They come marching down this about 5:30 in the morning, stop, fire off a volley, and then march on, drumming as they go. So if you haven't been shook out of bed by that volley of guns, I have, because I live close enough to it. An important point we have to realize is that fairly flat rivers mean that people are going to be farming, and fairly steep rivers and hilly areas are not good for farming, but lend themselves to mills. So the Assabet starts out as a flat river, then becomes steep. And because of that, it had a series of 8 different dams along it, each of them providing for industry. Some of these started out as what was a combination lumber and grist mills. So in season, they'd be sawing lumber or they'd be grinding grain in the spring and the fall. But they were converted to industry mills, making, again, planks, furniture, leather goods. In Maynard, the dam you're looking at, and it's hard to realize where this is, but if you're standing on the Waltham Street Bridge and you're looking upriver, so that on the right on this picture, you'd be looking at the back of McDonald's. And to the left out of the picture, you'd be seeing that the 7-Eleven Dunkin' Donuts store. This was the paper mill dam and predates the woolen mill. This was set up and created in 1835. So there was a small industry already here and a small population starting to be out in the goods. And then in 1846, Amory Maynard and his partner, William Knight, showed up and said, we're going to buy the Mill Street Dam, and we're going to take it apart, and we're going to build a larger dam upstream, which is where we know where 27 is, and we're going to make the mill downstream and connect the two by a canal. The purpose of this is by moving the dam upstream and the mill downstream, they had a larger vertical drop. And every foot of vertical drop represents horsepower. So the larger the drop, the more power you get. by creating a tremendous amount of water backed up and then situating the mill further downstream. They were able to have the water going over the top of a fairly large wheel, in fact, 2 wheels, generating, for their era, tremendous amounts of basically free power. And by backing up the water 5 miles, they had year-round power. They had enough water reserve. They could always power this up. And one point about these dams up and down the river that Henry David Thoreau pointed out is the mills operated from Monday morning until Saturday midday. And at that point, the river was shut off entirely. And from there till Monday morning, the water was backed up even higher so that Monday morning, they'd be ready to start running at full power. So he said, basically, these industrialists were turning the river on and off, and the river didn't do anything on the Sabbath. It rested also. How Maynard came to be was it was a fast-growing population because of the woolen mill kept on expanding. So that by 1870, you had close to 2,000 people living in close proximity and working at this mill on small lots, small houses, row houses, boarding houses, all actually either citizens of Stowe or citizens of Sudbury, but very far away from the centers of those towns, which meant that they were far away from church, they were far away from the shopping that was there, they were far away from schools, and they felt that they were deprived of services they deserved by their parent towns because they were out there on the fringe, and petitioned the state of Massachusetts to become their own town. Now there was, what you see here is Dave Griffin and Paul Boothroyd holding is an unofficial, never submitted first petition from 1870, asking not just to create a larger Maynard that took more of Stowe and Sudbury, but actually would take a chunk of Acton and Concord to include the gunpowder mill, which is on the Acton-Maynard border. This was not submitted. What was actually submitted in February of 1871, the official petition was for still a larger Maynard, but no chunk of Acton and Concord. And that was finally granted on April 19th, 1871. So again, we're very big on April 19th. On April 9th, 1871 was a much smaller Maynard. Basically, Sudbury and Stowe pushed back. Maynard was quite small, but had a larger population than either of its parent towns. And the borders are set by 5 stones, one at each corner of that 5-sided space, that 5.4 square miles. But it started out with a population of about 1,800, 1,900 people. And then we have to talk about the Maynards, because, and what we have here from left to right is Amory Maynard, his eldest son, Lorenzo, his middle son, William, and then his youngest son, Harlan. Sadly, we don't have pictures of their wives, but we do know that Amory and his wife, Mary, had these 3 sons. Lorenzo had 5 children, but none of them went on to marry and have children of their own. 2 married, 3 did not, and the 2 that married don't have children. William, his wife married, had 7 children, of which I think 2 or 3 had children. So there is a family line, which we'll get into. And Harlan died young. It might have been of typhus. They died in his teens. We do have, interestingly from Harlan, he had started a diary when he was 14. So we have a year and a half of wonderful description of his life, his family life, his interaction with his parents, them getting telegrams, because there was a telegram office from his father who was traveling up and down the East Coast buying wool, and his interactions with his brothers. So we really get a picture of what was going on in Maynard from the eyes of this teenage boy, who, by the way, was not going to school in Maynard. It felt he needed a better education than that. So he was taking the train every day to Concord, where he was going to school at a private school in Concord. His classmates were Ralph Waldo Emerson's children. And then he could take the afternoon train back to Maynard. So the Maynard family, and one of the points here is Amory was not an immigrant himself. He was 6th generation. The Maynards had come over in the 1630s. A large part of the New England population came over in that mass migration in the 1630s. So a lot of the names that you see were around here 5, 6 generations. But we run into Amory, who's living in Marlborough, in the mill business and the construction business. His water supply is bought up by the city of Boston because they want his water for Boston Water. he takes that wad of money. He's in his mid-40s. Could he retire rich? Yes. Instead, he partnered with William Knight, another person whose water rights had been bought. The two of them, quite wealthy, knowledgeable, skilled, came into Maynard and basically created the town. This is what the business they were in. These are basically bales of wool, each representing some 60 fleece per bale. In the grease meant that the wool tended to be sheared in the spring, bound up, not clean. So it had all the lanolin, the grease, the dirt, the dried urine, the feces, the twigs, horribly dirty stuff, baled up in these bales that weighed 300 to 500 pounds, and shipped off to Maynard, where it was going to be washed in water taken from the Assabet River and the wastewater dumped back into the Assabet River. So yes, this was that polluting business, very much so. And it started off with local, but once the railroad came in 1850, they started going farther afield to get wool. So wool was being sourced from Canada. In time, wool was being sourced from out by Montana and Idaho, and perhaps even from overseas, because there was just tremendous need for wool to run through this process. I'm leaping ahead 50 years now from the founding of this. And I do want to mention, when it came time to name this town, the proposal was, let's name it after Maynard, who of course was still alive and still running things. He basically employed most of the people in town, owned much of the housing in town he was charging rent for. So it was, quote unquote, unanimous that the town was going to be named Maynard after Amory Maynard. And that's the way it was from 1871. He died in 1890. His son Lorenzo took over as manager of the mill operation, but the mill went bankrupt in 1898. And it was tremendously disrupted. Not only people forced out of their jobs, but many of the employees had not always taken all of their pay, instead had the mill hold it for him as a de facto bank, because there was no bank in town. So the mill was working not just as an employer, but also as a bank, and employees were getting 6% interest on their savings, except when it got bankrupt, suddenly they only got 2/3 of their money back. And there was a strong suspicion that Lorenzo had taken out his share first before it went bankrupt. So there was a lot of animosity on both sides. Lorenzo hired out of town. Not only did he leave town, but shortly afterwards, he had his dead wife and his 4 dead daughters dug up out of the cemetery and moved to Mount Auburn, because he never wanted to come back here again. There's a beautiful mausoleum in Mount Auburn. It says Lorenzo Maynard over the door, and that's where his family and he are now. The company that bought the mill, the American Woolen Company, which is a multi-state conglomerate, sort of led this charge to change the name of the town, because there was animosity in town, and there were hearings held on this petition to change the name. People spoke heatedly for and against. And the book goes into some length of the newspaper articles that talk to people, said, you know, Amory made the town, Amory disappointed the town, Lorenzo took the money and ran. The proposal was to name the town Assabet, but it didn't happen. In the end, the state legislature killed the bill, and it never came to local vote, and Maynard became Maynard. The question then is, are there any descendants? And the answer is yes. There's no one living in Maynard who is descended from the Maynard family. There's also no one descended who has the last name Maynard, because the family sort of, it's a nice New England term, daughtered out. But daughters married other people. And there is a significant number of Maynard descendants living in the Worcester area. There's some more up and down the East Coast, and out, I think it's the Arizona, New Mexico. So in 2018, I invited as many Maynard descendants as possible to come visit Maynard. Gave them a tour, fed them a dinner, put up some at our house, and we had just a wonderful time. You can see the doors open to the back. We walked in, we got to see the inside of the crypt, the beautiful colored skylight that's over it, Amory Maynard's first house, second house, Lorenzo's house, walked through the mill And I think they all had just a really good time being here. So these are great, great, great grandchildren. Some of them themselves have children and grandchildren of Amory Maynard. And we were hoping that in 2021 for our Sesquicentennial celebrations, that the Maynard family can come join us, perhaps for a parade or a concert or event. So we hope to see them again. The clock tower, so emblematic of Maynard, was built by Lorenzo Maynard in 1892 in memory of his father. And I'm going to say Lorenzo had a bit of an edifice complex, because if you ever get down to Mount Auburn and visit his crypt out there, his mausoleum, it's pretty much the tallest one in the entire cemetery. It's got 2 towers and it's got 5 stained glass windows, and it's impressive. But he built us this clock. It still has the original mechanism. It has to be mechanically wound. Every Monday, it's an 8-day mechanism. Every Monday, someone goes up there and winds up the counterweight for the clock and the counterweight for the bells. And these are basically giant grandfather clocks with a 9-foot long pendulum, sort of swinging back this side, that side. The weights move down from the top of this all the way down to the first floor over the course of the week, and it's wound up again. So we hear it chime. So there's a couple of things I want to say about the clock. Roman numeral clocks traditionally do not have what we think of as the Roman numeral number 4. If you look very closely at this, you see the 4 is actually 4 lines, not what we call a 1/V. And that's what you should see on any Roman numeral clock. I don't know why, but that's the way it is. Secondly, I took this picture with the time at 1210 because 1210 is very important to the history of Maynard. And if you've ever looked at the street signs, the town vehicles, our town seal, it shows the clock tower and it shows the time as 1210. The reason being is that dating back to the 1890s, the town has rung its, first it was a fire alarm, and then it was a steam whistle, and then it was a fire horn at 1210 every afternoon as a test for the horn, until actually the horn broke about 8-9 years ago, and it stopped. So what we happen is suddenly we have the absence of a tradition of Maynard. And the question is, why 1210? Well, the point was the mill blew its own whistle at 12 noon to start its lunch shift. And to make sure the two were separated from each other, the town said, okay, we'll do ours at 1210, which is one story. The other story is to make sure it was exactly on time, is the person in charge of this, as it kept close to noon, would walk to the train station and get the official train station 12 o'clock time, change his watch to 12, walk back to the fire station, took him about 8-9 minutes to walk back, and then when his watch got to 1210, would blow the 1210 horn. So you have 2 stories there. I'm going to say both of them are true enough to be true, but this is it. If you look at that clock and you remember 1210, you've got a whole piece of Maynard's history right there. And we're leaping ahead again, but not far. The first car in Maynard was a Stanley Steamer. Stanley was a couple of brothers, Massachusetts brothers, were making steam-powered cars in 1899. But you can see from the lighter colored line in this, which sort of peaks at 1900 at 250, there were maximally about 250 horses in Maynard. And then it gradually dropped off. And even into the 1930s, there was still a significant number of horses in Maynard. There are now no horses. We are a no-horse town, but there was a period in there where this was still a one-horse town. There were also many cows. You can see that there were hundreds of cows. Well into the 1930s, there were more than 100 cows. So this was also a dairying town. Milk would be collected, loaded onto the train, shipped off perhaps to Boston, used locally, used to make cheese. But this was a horse. It was a cow town. It was also a pig town. It was a chicken town. It was a town with muddy roads and horses leaving their souvenirs on the road. It was a pretty stinky, pretty fly-ridden town too. We don't see it anymore. The roads are paved, most of them. There's no horses, there's no cows. There's a couple of alpacas, there's some pygmy goats. There are chickens out there, but no horses or cows or pigs anymore. You're gonna have to ignore that phone for a moment and we'll get on. Maynard, prior to national prohibition, was mostly a wet town. People don't realize that leading up to national prohibition, individual states, counties, and towns would vote themselves wet or dry, and Maynard and other Massachusetts towns voted themselves every year for the decision whether the next year the town be wet or dry. Maynard was often a wet town surrounded by dry towns. Acton was dry, Concord was dry, Stowe was dry, Hudson was dry, Marlborough tended to stay wet. The important point here is there was a trolley system from 1900 to 1921 that connected all these towns to Maynard. So someone in the dry town of Stowe or Acton could hop on the trolley, come to Maynard, buy up their alcoholic beverages and go home and be happy for the week. Interesting thing is, now here we are 100 years later, and Maynard is soon to have 3 marijuana stores, while Acton, Stowe, I believe, Concord have voted themselves no marijuana. So we will once again be the wet town or the smoking town surrounded by the dry towns. So what you see on the right side is some marijuana buds sort of pre-trimmed and then trimmed down, which will be, I'm sure, for sale and bring lots of people to Maynard because here we are and people want what they want. Again, we're leaping ahead. The mill owned hundreds of houses. All of what's referred to as Presidential Village was all built around 1900, 1902, 1903, when the mill was expanding rapidly. And all those houses in various different styles, the mill decided in the middle of the Depression in 1934 that it didn't want to be in the house business anymore. And they were selling here, you say, at public auction to the highest bidder, 150 dwellings. The average price for a house was $900. So if you're living there now and the house was bought by your grandparents, your great-grandparents, it's worth a lot more now, and your family did well by buying one of those houses in the Presidential Village. Most of the houses were bought by residents of Maynard. So there weren't speculators so much. In some cases, some people bought out a house they were in, but they were able to buy another smaller house. So a lot of the purchases stayed there. And you can see you were supposed to pony up 25% and the rest stayed on mortgage at 6%, but it was a fast mortgage. I think a 3 or 4 year mortgage. But people bet that they were going to make it and they hung on and they bought these houses, and Maynard stayed stable rather than having hundreds of vacant houses. Another shock to Maynard was in 1942. In 1942, we're in the throes of World War II, and the US Army decides that it needs to have a large munitions storage area to load ships from the Boston Navy Yard with their munitions, but they didn't want to have it too close to the shore because it might be shelled by German battleships. So they figured they needed an area at least safely 20 miles inland where they could build a large munitions area. And they took a very big chunk of land from Sudbury, Maynard, Hudson, and Stowe. This is nearly 4 square miles from those towns. About 800 of the acres was from Maynard. It represented about 20% of Maynard. And the people living there were basically, this was taken by eminent domain. They were basically offered what the government considered a fair price. They may have not considered a fair price. They felt they had no other option. They were forced off the land, sometimes as rapidly as like 10 days. Notice they had to auction off or sell off their animals and their farm equipment. They couldn't take anything that was, attached to the house. So no sheds, no cupboards, no built-in, chairs or furniture that was built in, and they had to get out. And the government said, okay, when the war's over, you can have it back. But that did not happen. The Army kept it. And it became a testing area referred to as Natick Labs. And only at around 2000 was it cleaned up and became what is now the National Wildlife Refuge. The reason it wasn't turned over to realtors or separate properties, it was so polluted that it was not safe for residences or businesses. Even though it was a Superfund cleanup site, the Army had done so much testing there. They did burn testing, asbestos, fire-resistant cloth testing. They had chemical dumps, 55-gallon drums leaking, there were retaining ponds leaking. So again, super fun cleanup site, clean enough to allow people to visit as a wildlife refuge, clean enough for wildlife, but not clean enough for people to live in. So we now have this very nice wildlife refuge as part of Maynard. Now, the image you see on the right is the blueprint of what these bunkers looked like. So there was the lightning rod up the center. There's sort of a curved area going across that represents the dirt. And then there's a much smaller sort of half circle, which is the actual open bunker space with a door at the end. And that's where the munitions were kept. And then right across the front, there was a railroad track to load these in and load these out. Oh, another reason why people can't live there is to keep the weeds and such down from growing up through the railroad, as they were using an arsenic-based herbicide to kill the plants. So all in all, nice we don't live there, but also nice that we have this as a wildlife refuge. The Army was not the only group polluting in Maynard. As we said, there were mills up and down the river that were dumping their waste. Town sewage was mildly processed or went into a septic tank and perhaps seeped into the river, or a cess tank that had to be emptied out, but also might be leaking into the river. The river smelled vile. And people tended to also figure if you threw stuff in the river, it went away. So the shot you see on the left is from 1974. It's a shot from underneath the Walnut Street Bridge. People would stop on the night in the middle of the Walnut Street Bridge and throw their tires in the river and drive off. And they'd also throw their tires in the river over by where the Elks building is. And the picture you see on the right is what it looks like now, because the river has been cleaned up through the efforts of ORS, which was the organization of the Assabet Sudbury Concord River. 35 years of cleanup, taking literally hundreds upon hundreds of tires and other types of trash, construction waste, rebar, glass. You saw a lot of glass over by the bridge behind CVS, which is now the Rail Trail Bridge, because that tended to be an area where alcoholics drank, lived, squatted. There were some shanties there. There was sort of behind Main Street in that little area behind the Derm, and a lot of drinking went on, and bottles got thrown at the river. At one point, someone asked me if it was okay kids asked me if it was okay to wade in the river. I said, no, it's broken glass all the way down, because every spring, the high water moves things around, the low water, and you see just a lot more broken glass in the river. But the river is remarkably cleaner than it was 50 years ago. And the nice thing about it is cleanliness is contagious. So much less gets dumped into the river anymore. No one's throwing tires in the river anymore. People aren't throwing construction stuff or bottles so much in the river anymore. So the river continues to get cleaner from these macro things. The wastewater treatment plants on the river are much better at not allowing phosphorus and nitrogen to go into the river from their waste, which means there's less of the algae and plant blooms, the algae blooms and the duckweed blooms. So it doesn't get that rotting algae smell in the summer. So the river continues to become cleaner and cleaner. It still means you shouldn't really eat more than one fish a week out of the river, and not if you're a child or pregnant. But there it is, the river bed is, the sediment is contaminated and stays contaminated. Maynard has had, not this newspaper, but a weekly newspaper by different names since 1888, continues to have a weekly paper, which is nice for me because I have a place to write stories too. And this is a relatively recent issue, so you see there's the coronavirus in it. So, but the town library has on microfilm all past, almost missing some, but many years upon years upon years of back issues of the newspapers on microfilm. So it's possible to sit down there and scroll through and look for stories and look for what happened during World War I and look for what happened during the Spanish flu epidemic, and mine that for historical information. So it's one of those places I tend to end up when the library is open, is going through those old newspapers on microfilm to find ideas for stories. Maynard was a praying town. Each group that came here had their own church they wanted, their own place they wanted to worship. So we had the Congregational Church, the oldest, which has now become the sanctuary closed, the Methodist Church, St. Bridget's, started out with a church actually where the police station is now and became too small, built this much larger church. And this is sort of an early version of what it looked like over on, I think, Sudbury Street. So there it is, St. Bridget's, looking quite different than it is now, but the bones of the church are the same. Few small trees there have gotten larger. I think those are either gas lights or electric lights. But the 14 places of worship have since reduced to 6. The 2 Lutheran churches have closed, the Episcopalian church closed, the Jewish synagogue closed, the Polish Catholic church closed, the Congregational Church, the Methodist Church. We are no longer a nation of prayers. And if even though when people do want to go to church, they want a church with its own parking lot, which Maynard couldn't offer. So people will go to church in a town neighboring over, which has its own parking lot. And we're back to text. Most of you know, in fact, most of you are probably members of our attempt to start a new food cooperative. So I just want to touch on a very long history of cooperatives here in Maynard. And this is a major, section of the book because it talks about the whole history. The concept of cooperatives was started in England and then migrated over here. Started off with the English one. The Sovereigns of Industry became the Riverside Cooperative Association, and had the building, which was on the corner of Nason and Summer, where the Knights of Columbus building now is. Because that building was a 4-story wooden building burned in 1936, but there was the first major co-op. There was an attempt to start a Finnish co-op in 1899, but there weren't enough Finns here yet. The major influx of Finns sort of started around 1900, 1910, 1920, especially at the time of the Finnish Civil War and the Finnish War of Independence from Russia, which is around 1919. And therefore, you see the beginnings of a Finnish cooperative, 1907, which became a very large cooperative, renamed as the United Cooperative Society, 1921, and had a span of some 50 years. This was one of the 10 largest cooperatives in the United States. It had not just the store, it had its own butchery, its own bakers, milk delivery, coal delivery, gas station, summer camp. It was just a major, major effort based here in Maynard. The co-ops basically wound down with the advent of supermarkets that could compete with them on price, could offer parking. You didn't have to be a member. And so it was that was sort of the finally winding out of cooperatives, but extremely successful for a very long time. There are a few other ones that lasted for a while. You had International Milk Association, which was basically bought out and merged into Cleva. First National Cooperative. Some of this were their Finns because the Cleva /United was a little bit socialist. You had the non-socialist Finns wanted their own. A Russian cooperative didn't quite get off the ground, so it only lasted a year or two before it was basically bought out. A stab in the 80s, the Carrot Tree Co-op, and now we hope to have a new cooperative opening up in Maynard. Okay, another whole chapter on Digital Equipment Corporation. I have to look up something as I'm talking here, so give me a moment. Ken Olsen and his brother and a friend founded this in the 1957s, and digital was here for 41 years. It started out as a small operation, renting a small space in the mill, about 8,000 square feet, and grew rapidly, profitable first year on, grew rapidly until by the mid-1970s, it had occupied almost 90% of the mill and finally bought it out and became, the headquarters for a world operation that at its peak around 1990, employed over 100,000 people worldwide. This was the second largest computer company in the world after IBM. And Maynard was referred to as the mini computer capital of the world. This was the nexus of a whole East Coast, Boston-centered, MIT, Harvard started sets of companies. You had Digital, you had Wang, you had Bose. This 128 was the golden road of these companies, and Maynard was with them. And the question was, why Maynard? Why Maynard? Why did he choose? The answer is, what he and his partners were looking for is they're looking for low rent and a experienced workforce. And you have to realize the woolen mill had made it to around 1950. So he's looking for an underemployed, skilled workforce, primarily women, which is again what was employed at the mill. And that's one of the, and the question is, why primarily women? Because a lot of the work required very dexterous, small finger, small hand work, and the women were better suited for doing this small, careful work than men. So this town basically made that evolution from a fading woolen mill to a ramping up very quickly of the computer center with the manufacturer. There was even what referred to as the mother's shift, because rather than working a full day, the women would come in when their kids went off to school, and then their workday would end soon enough that they could get home before their kids got home from school. So the company from day one was very also flexible and providing jobs for women and providing advancement for women. Now, our second person we see in this, see, I should have done my homework. Is Barbara Stephenson, the first woman engineer hired by Digital in 1961. So really just 4 years after the company, hired personally by Ken Olsen, who would MIT graduate himself and would go into MIT every year and sort of scoop up the best and the brightest from the electrical engineering department. And he hired Barbara as a computer engineer. She was the first woman engineer, and she would field calls because she was sort of the customer interface on some of this technology. And she'd call, and people would call and say, I want to speak with an engineer. And she'd say, I'm an engineer. And she'd say, no, I want to speak with a real engineer. She said, well, tell me what the application you want, because you're looking at the manual, aren't you? She says, I wrote the manual. I'm the engineer you want to talk to. So talk to me now or hang up the phone. And she said the line would go dead for a moment. And she sort of hear the guy on the phone try to put his hand over it and says, hey, I'm talking to a woman engineer. But she succeeded. She moved up. Other women moved up to higher management, vice president levels. The company was very open to having women move up within the company, very open to having minorities move up in the company, very open to the fact that people might have a different sexual orientation, and that no prejudice was allowed in this company. So it was one of the most forward-looking companies as far as equality for minorities, for women, for people of different sexual orientation in the entire country. Had a tremendous reputation, not by accident, because it worked hard to make that work. And that's sort of all covered in the book. So you see the digital this week, there were digital shirts, there were digital cups, there were digital newsletters, there were digital everything, there were digital, and then they started having their major international convention each year. And one year it was going to be in Boston, and they realized that because there were some competing events going on in Boston, every hotel room in Boston was already booked, and they had to find space for a couple of thousand more people. So what they did quickly was decide to charter these two ocean liners and have them pull up to the Boston Harbor, and they used that as their overflow hotel space for their convention. Digital made certain major mistakes in the late 1980s into the 90s, tried to downsize itself back to profitability, sold off bits and pieces, and finally shrank enough to the point that they fired Ken Olsen, their first and only president at that point, turned over to someone else whose job was pretty much to find a buyer. And the company was sold to Compaq, and that was the end in 1998. We're leaping forward again, but we're also looking back at businesses which have been around here more than 50 years. So the Fowler Kennedy Funeral Home was founded by Henry Fowler, one of the signers of the petition to create Maynard in 1871. The business is as old as the town of Maynard. Erickson's Ice Cream started off as a dairy, became ice cream. They have been here some 80 plus years. The book touches on all a series of companies that have been here more than 50 years, because I think we have to honor the fact that these companies either have stayed in the same family or have kept the name, even under different owners, same business, and they're still with us. So again, Butler Lumber, Erickson's Ice Cream, Jarma's Auto Shop. There's at least a dozen Ray's Bicycle Shop. It's a 2-generation business now that have been with us for a long time. Now, one of the changes most of you are aware that I've been involved with heavily is the Assabet River Rail Trail. Started volunteering on that soon after Gene and I moved to town here in 2000. And in 2018, the Maynard section finally came to fruition, to completion, to being open. So you now have 3.4 miles of rail trail paved that runs you from the Stowe border on the south side to the Acton train station on the north side. What you see in this picture is the bridge over the Assabet, which was manufactured in the parking lot, and then you see it being lifted by this crane and lowered into place on the foundations built for it. I had taken 2 sets of pictures. I had taken pictures of the old bridge being lifted out, which was taken 6 months before that. And to do that, I was actually standing in the middle of the river taking pictures as the bridge moved up and out. This picture was actually taken by a drone camera operated by the company that was installing the bridge. They were nice enough to share their pictures with us. I think it's just an iconic picture of a change in Maynard, that we now have this rail trail running through the center of Maynard, which is, tremendous amounts, I think, traffic and joy to the people of Maynard. There's also a section where you're from Maynard if you remember, which this is a very short part of it, lists some 200 different businesses or things that are part of being only in Maynard. So some of you will remember many of these, few of these, but the fact that there was a mink farm for 50 years, that Sid owned his own airport, that Paul's Bakery was with us a long time, that only in Maynard t-shirts were with us for a short time, that there was a Maynard hotel, and there was a Maynard motel, and there was our own soda company and a bus line, and Leaping Lena, a tricked out car that used to be in the parades, the Woodrow Wilson School before it burned, Donutland before it became a different business entirely. A cast iron kitchen went away in Backrack's Grocery. So there's a bit of memory lane there in the book about just the things that keep changing in Maynard as time goes on. All right, a bit of wonky numberish. By going through the town annual reports, again at the library, I was able to compile this. So the right-hand side and the line that gradually slopes up from left to right is the population of the town, which is sort of recently flattened out around 10,000. But you can see where it starts in 1890 at about 2,000, has a steep uptick around 1900 when the mill was bought by American Woolen Company, expanded, hired more people, and then a transition again from about 1960 to 70 when digital's growing, other companies here, a bit of a bedroom suburb, and then we sort of flattened out. There's not much room for expansion in Maynard because there's not much land to build on. There's also questions of limits to how much water we have and how much sewage we can handle. So Maynard is heading towards a population of 11,000, but I doubt it's ever going to get to 12,000 or 13,000 or 14,000 because there's just not a place for people to go. Now, important point I want to say here is when you look at this and you see, let's say around World War II, and the population is about 7,000. At that point, and up until that point, Maynard had a larger population than Acton, Sudbury, and Stowe combined. Those towns, which now, especially Acton and Sudbury, have surpassed us in population, and Stowe, which is getting to be chicken farms and apple orchards and low density rural places till really after World War II, when they popped into suddenly becoming bedroom suburbs. All the while, Maynard was the place with the train and the hotels, trolley, and the restaurants and Sears and Woolworths, and just so much was, and cigar makers and bars and perhaps a brewery and movie theaters. So there was so much going on here in Maynard, and then it is still that core downtown that makes it more of a walkable center town rather than the sprawly ex-farm towns which don't have centers. There is no there or the shopping plaza, but Maynard was and is, that sort of compact town. The other mill towns that look the same, Hudson, larger example, Clinton. Again, Hudson bled off from Marlborough once its population grew around its own mills, which were mostly, I think, leather goods. And each of these things, 100 years later, when the mills are gone, still feel different if they were mill town versus a farm town. The other two curves, the one kinking around towards the bottom is deaths by year. And you notice just over the word deaths, right over the A in deaths, there's a little spike. That is the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, 1919. Gradually, deaths drop off, even though the population is going up because people are living longer. And you also get this interesting spikes in births. So you had a lot of young immigrants moving in, and especially Catholic immigrants moving in, Irish and Italians around 1900, and marrying and having large families. So this huge spike in births around 1900, 1910, 1920. And you had another spike after World War II, which was the population explosion that occurred after the war ended. And then you've got this odd stuff going on in 1990. So I think all in all, this one figure gives you an interesting idea of the dynamics of change going on in Maynard. And then we get into things that are basically recent and fun and new. So Maynard Rocks has been with us a couple of years. Trail of Flowers, an effort to plant flowers along the rail trail, also with us a couple of years. And each are part of what's making Maynard interesting, as is Art Space, as is the art galleries up and down Main Street, and the restaurants and their outdoor dining. So Maynard continues to, I think, become interesting in a dynamic cultural sort of way that I look forward to continuing. Let's see what we have left. We have a Maynard Cultural District, which is sort of like the Central Triangle, plus some blebs to include the library and art space. And I want to point out that the town is run by state law, by town meetings. And this is where we show up, we decide what our town is going to be, and we write our little yes or no checks, and we put them in these baskets. They bring them up to the front, and they count the votes, and that's how we make our town run. That's the dynamic that we have to participate in, because if we don't do that, then someone else is running Maynard. And you know what? That's my last slide. So I'm going to stop share. I'm going to turn it over to Sally, who can help people ask questions. So I need someone to float a first question out here, and then we'll get going.
So feel free to type into the chat or just unmute yourself and ask David directly.
Buy the book. If you haven't already bought, if you have bought the book, buy another one to give to someone else as a present.
So again, that's this Saturday, 10 to 12 at the Maynard Library parking lot.
Someone has to unmute.
I have a question. Hi. What, David, was one of the most inspiring or maybe surprising things that you discovered in writing this book?
Again, the book was a production of the entire committee, because we had to sort of shape to what those chapters would be. But in doing the research and finding the stories, I think one areas that I felt had not been adequately covered was the transition from the Native American to the colonial era, and being able to actually get information directly from Nipmuc descendants to hear the Native American side of that story, was very interesting.
Wow, thank you.
David, we had two questions in the chat. Where is the Marble Whitney Parmenter homestead located? And is anyone buried in the Maynard tomb in Glenwood Cemetery?
Okay, so the first is on the north side of Maynard, right next to the rail trail, across from Christmas Motors. You have Christmas Motors, Route 27, the rail trail, and right next to the rail trail is the Marble family site. The foundation is there. They're sort of, and that's also where many of the daffodils have been planted. And people say, okay, why did they build so close to the railroad? But you have to realize when they built the house, that was 150 years before the railroad got there. So the railroad got built close to the house. I'm sure when the railroad showed up in 1850 and you started seeing 10, 15 trains a day chugging by, coughing up smoke and embers, they weren't happy, but they were still living there. So that's where the Marble family homestead was. And they were for a long time in basically the horse business. They ran a livery. They kept people's horses and wagons. So if you needed your horse, you would, send a message to someone, I need the horse and wagon today. So they were in the livery business. And the second question, who's in the tomb? It's a good question. The answer is 22 people. But who those people are is a bit surprising because you have Amory Maynard, you have his wife, Mary. You have only one of the three children, Harlan, their youngest son. Lorenzo, as I said before, had that beautiful mausoleum built in Mount Auburn, and that's where he and his wife and his 5 children, their spouses are. William, the middle son, had a bit of a falling out, but also he developed tuberculosis, so he decided to go off to a place in a hot, dry climate to try to cure his tuberculosis. And where he ended up was Pasadena, California. So he and most of his family moved off there. It actually cured his disease, and then he moved back east, but he decided that Worcester was where he was going to live. So he and his family, most of them, lived and they're buried in Worcester. So of the 3 children, only one's in the tomb. Of the 11 grandchildren, only 1 is in the tomb. So it doesn't really start getting to great-grandchildren that people said, okay, I am owed a free burial from William. And that's sort of the attractiveness is. Basically any Maynard descendant can be interred there for free. So we still have people showing up now with the cremation remains of their parents and say, listen, I'd just like to drop them off here. And so you got 22 people there, the most recent one in a few years ago.
Okay, a question from Anne. Were there any prominent citizens in what is now Maynard during the colonial era? And if so, who?
No. Maynard is almost bereft of notable people. Concord, so, obviously Concord was sort of an educational and creative center, and that's where you lived, or that's where you moved. But Maynard was, during that era, basically it was mean land. It was tough to farm. It was hilly. You might graze some cattle and some sheep, but for example, and this is hard to believe, but Massachusetts was the first colony to legalize slavery in 1640. It's also the first state to end it in 1780, but for those 140 years in between, slavery was legal in Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, and there were no slaves owned in what became Maynard because the people who lived there were basically too poor. Slaves are basically prestige items that you owned if you were a wealthy farmer, a politician, a minister. So Concord, residents of Concord had like 20, total of 20 or 30 slaves. All of Concord, residents of Sudbury, again, 15, 20 slaves, but none in Maynard, mostly because people were just too poor.
Okay, and a question from Lee. I hadn't heard before that Ken Olsen chose Maynard in part because of the potential female workforce. How did you learn this?
There is an advertisement. I'm trying to think whether it was actually in the book. I think it is. That's my digital. okay, it's not a book, but is an advertisement from 1959 that said women wanted with the dexterity to do fine work. So it was specifically looking to hire more women to do the fine motor work of actually putting the various transistors into the board and then flipping them over and soldering the other side. So they were deliberately, and also another point was his wife was Finnish, and it may have been just a comfort to her to be able to visit him or in a town. They weren't living in Maynard, but to visit a town where many people spoke Finnish, because the town at that point was about 20% Finnish. That had been the last major immigrant group to come to work at the woolen mill.
A question from Linda. What is the oldest building in Maynard now?
You've got a few houses and perhaps a school building or two that date to maybe the 1750s, 1770. So there are a number of buildings that predate 1800, not a lot. And again, it wasn't until 1850. This was a small hamlet. This was small. You had a couple of major roads, a tavern on some of those roads going through, but it was until the woolen mill came, it was a low population. So again, I'm gonna say you might have things 1770, 1790.
Anne says Silas Brooks' house is 1764 on Summer Street.
Yes, so that actually was a school, and it's now part of a private residence. But as you're driving on Summer Street on the north side, there's a white painted brick building that was one of the was a Stowe school.
And a question from Charles: where did all the bricks for the mill come from?
Cambridge. And I say that because the railroad from Boston ran through Cambridge, and Cambridge was a major brickworks. There was the clay and the sand and the Irish labor there to make bricks. So, and you had things like the New England Brick Company. Now, bricks were the very first branded items. Brick companies would have lettering or symbols into the bottom of the mold. So when the clay of the brick was pushed down into the mold by hand, it would take the imprint on the bottom. So when the brick was fired, you'd see lettering. And for example, I found out that one of the major companies there was the New England Brick Company, and its symbol was NEBCO. And then I went to my backyard where I've got some bricks that we ended up from this place, that by third one I flipped over, there it is, NEBCO on the bottom of the brick. The bricks came from Cambridge, and they came out here by train.
Okay, and more on the oldest house. Anne is saying Silas Brooks' house is at 88 Summer Street. Excuse me. And the brick schoolhouse is 101 Summer Street.
Yes. And there was another school that's actually on Acton Street, the end of Maple Court, but it's really at the corner of Concord and Acton Streets, that was actually moved. It had been a school on the south side of town. It had been a Sudbury school, and then was, just moved up and turned into a private residence. So it also has a plaque, one of the Maine Historical Commission plaques on it, that says this is also one of the old schools that dates to like the 1790s, 1780s.
Okay, any more questions? All right, well, I want to thank David for speaking tonight, and we'll hope to see everyone on Saturday at the library.
Thank you all for your time. I'm sorry we couldn't offer you refreshments, but hopefully in the comfort of your own home, you're able to manage just fine on your own.
This is Loretta. I just want to say that I bought the book last week, and I'm reading it, and it's very enjoyable. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, the book is sort of broken up into like 80 or 90 fairly short segments, so you can sort of just pick it up anywhere, read a segment, get a bit of an image of what was going on. So you don't have to read it right through or consecutively, but it's sort of designed for easy segmented reading.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, Sally, thank you so much to the Maynard Public Library for being the host for this.
Our pleasure, and good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank